Chanting is very loud. I can't hear her. Mataji.
Okay. Hare Krishna, everyone. Can anyone hear me now?
I can hear you. Yes, we can hear.
1 minute, Mataji. I don't want to do the slideshow.
Just go like that.
Hare Krishna, everyone. Today's presentation is on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, Chapter 29, talks between Narada Muni and King Pracinabarhi. So in the past, like almost 3 to 4 chapters, we have seen how Narada Muni was telling the allegorical story to King Pracinabarhi about King Puranjana. But then this chapter is the main conclusion. So I'm just going to read a few important notes here. From chapter 25 to 28, Narada Muni told an allegorical story of King Puranjana to King Pracinabarhi. In this chapter, Narada Muni is mainly conveying the narration and the meaning of the allegorical story. This chapter is very, very important, mainly because we have 2 reasons. Because Maitreya Muni had heard this story from his spiritual master, and it is full of spiritual knowledge. And anyone who understands the purpose of this allegory, he will certainly be relieved from the bodily conception and will clearly understand life after death. And he will also understand what is transmigration of the soul actually is by studying this narration. So please listen carefully. Okay? After Narada Muni said all this, King Pracinabarhi he did not understand the complete story. So King Pracinabarhi very humbly he replied to Narada Muni saying that he could not completely understand the story, and he said, who is in perfect spiritual knowledge alone can understand, but since I'm overly attached to these fruitive activities, it's very difficult for me to realize the purpose of this story. So Narada Muni said, okay, I'll make it very easy for you. So King Puranjana, that's what referred, is actually living entity. And we all know that living entity transmigrates according to his own work into different types of bodies. It can be 1-legged, 2-legged, 3-legged, 4-legged, and sometimes even legless. And there's another main character who was in the story was old friend of Puranjana after he became woman. And that's none other than Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the master and eternal friend of the living entity. But what happens, just like living entities, they cannot realize the Supreme Personality of Godhead by the material names, activities, or qualities. Even King Puranjana, he could not realize his friend. But then another question is, why only we get human form? Why not the other is 1-legged, 3-legged, and no leg like that? Because when the living entity wants to enjoy the modes of material nature in their totality, then he prefers to get a human body or a demigod. So when one takes shelter of the material intelligence, the problem is he identifies himself with the material body, influenced by the material consciousness of I, mine, then he begins to enjoy and suffer through his senses. Thus, this is how the living entity is entrapped. So this is all from text 1 to 4. And now let's see the next slide. So in this chapter, again, to simplify, Narada Muni is giving 4 analogies. The first analogy, which we already know from the previous 2 chapters, is where like he compared the city, body, different gates. So I just made a table, but I'll not go over everything because then it'll take more time. And this chapter is like mainly like it has like 85 verses. So this is one, it will be very easy to understand, like what is head, ears, nostrils, mouth, hands, all the other organs. So And mainly important ones I'll pick, like mouth, genitals, and rectum. They are like different gates of the body. Right ear, left ear, sorry, right ear, left ear. It's like southern gate, northern gate. And then we have these two doors, like two nostrils. And then we also had hands, legs in the previous slide. So very important note Narad Muni makes here. Being helped by the hands and legs, the living entity performs all kinds of work and moves here and there. And then we all have heart, which is like Antavpura. The queen is one's intelligence. And how this is important is, while one is awake or asleep, that intelligence creates different situations. By being influenced by this contaminated intelligence, the living entity envisions something and simply imitates the actions and reactions of his intelligence. And then again, he continues the same analogy. Like it's like we are picturizing a story, a person, his family, city, kingdom, everything. So this is the detailed analysis of all other parts of this story. Okay, this is all in from text 5 to text 17. Now let's go to the next slide. Another analogy here is chariot, like how chariot is compared to various parts of the body. And then Narad Muni is making it even more easier because the previous one was like too complicated. So chariot is like a body. The horses, as you, sorry. That's fine, I'll go from here. So the chariot is like a body, as we are seeing in the picture. We have a chariot, and then the horses are like senses. As the time passes, year after year, these horses run without obstruction, and in fact, they make no progress. That's what we're doing in our body. And every chariot has two wheels. The two wheels are pious and impious activities, and the chariot's flags. There are three modes of material nature, and the rope is like mind, and the 5 types of life air constitute the living entity's bondage. The chariot driver is our intelligence. The sitting place in the chariot is our heart, and the knotting place is the dualities of life, such as pleasure and pain. And the coverings of the chariot is like 7 elements, 5 external processes like working senses, and the soldiers are like 11 senses. The summary is, being engrossed in sense enjoyment, the living entity seated on the chariot hankers after fulfillment of his false desires and runs after sense enjoyment, life after life. So this is more simplified analogy that Narad Muni gives to Pracinabarhi. And this is from text 18 to 20. So let's go to the next slide. And the same analogy continues, like which is like continuation of the King Puranjana. So Chandavega, this applies to all of us. Chandavega is nothing but powerful time. Gandharvas and Gandharvis is days and nights, like 360 days. Kalakanya is old age. And the followers of Evaneshwara is like various types of disturbances for body. Prajvara is fear. So with all this, what happens? The body's lifespan is gradually reduced by the passage of days and nights, which is 360. Like we all know that in a year, we have 360 days. And then none of us want to accept old age. We all want to remain young. But Evaneshwara, he's not merciful. He's like death. He accepts old age as his sister, and then he comes behind us. So that's another simple analogy from text 21 to 25. Now let's go to the next slide. So after giving this brief 2 analogies, Narad Muni is saying, my dear king, this is what we need to remember. So I'm not going to read every line because it's a lot here, but I'm going to touch on the important points. So the living entity is mainly disturbed by many tribulations, but still he gets carried away by many plans. Why? Because of his lust to enjoy the world. But what happens, out of his ignorance, he accepts all these kind of material miseries under the pretext of just one important reason, which is false ego, i.e. mine. In this way, he lives for 100 years within this body. And also, Krishna gives a little bit of independence for his man to accept good or bad. But The problem is when we actually forget the Supreme Master, who is the personality of Godhead, then he gives up himself into the modes of material nature, just like falling into a well, because we forgot the master. And what happens with this three modes of material nature? We have three modes: mode of goodness, mode of passion, mode of darkness. When we act piously according to Vedic injunctions, follow regulative principles, then most of the time we are in mode of goodness. And then if we engage in various fruitive activities, then we will be in mode of passion. Then darkness, which is most dangerous one, it's subject to various types of misery, and we live like in an animal kingdom. So why all this happens? Because we are covered with the mode of ignorance. So the conclusion, what Narada Muni is saying in his first teaching, is that his acceptance of different types of bodies is brought about by his activities under the influence of modes of nature. This is from text 26 to 29. So let's go to the next slide. So we already saw Narada Muni gave two analogies, and that's one is about King Puranjana, city, kingdom, and the second one was the chariot. Now the third one is very simple one, but lot of meaning. The living entity is exactly like a dog who goes from door to door for some food. But what happens? Not every time he's lucky. According to his destiny, he either receives punishment or he's driven out, or at times he may get little food. So Narada Muni is saying, similarly, the living entity, being influenced by so many desires, he wanders in different species of life according to destiny. Sometimes he's high, sometimes he's low, sometimes he goes to heavenly planets, sometimes to hell, and sometimes to the middle planets, and so on. So how much ever living entities, they try to counteract with all these miserable conditions, they have to remain conditioned by the law of nature. We cannot escape that. And another good example is what man is trying to do. We carry a burden on our head, and then when it is heavy, we carry with our shoulder, just like when you carry 20 pounds of rice bag, you can keep it on your head, then you feel heavy, and then you carry with your hand, and then you exchange it to another hand. Like that, Narada Muni is saying, all he's doing here is to put the same burden from one place to another. But then what is the solution? Narada Muni says, very easy. Just like when we have a dream, we cannot relieve it with a troublesome hallucination. We counteract by only awakening. So our material existence is due to our ignorance and illusion. We must awaken to Krishna consciousness, which is the ultimate solution to all problems. So here Narada Muni gave three analogies and then explained like how miserable condition we are in if we forget Krishna. So the solution is only when we awaken to Krishna consciousness, we feel that is the ultimate solution. Now the next slide again, he says, let's say we get a dream. You see a tiger in the dream. You don't get up from the bed and then walk around. Let's say we see a snake in our dream. We don't run chasing that, thinking that, oh, a snake is behind me. But only when we are awakened, then you'll think, oh, I have to act. There's a tiger, I have to run. So but the problem is the real interest of the living entity is to get out of this nuisance that causes him to endure repeated birth and death. But how is it possible? Only through devotional service. So he's stressing here another point, like you have to be awake. Without awakening, you'll still be here, wandering here and there. And how do you awake? Only through devotional service. When we do devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, you will automatically get detached from this material world and you will get the real knowledge. And then ultimately, Narada Muni is saying in one sentence, only we will become eligible to see Supreme Personality of Godhead only when you hear the glories of Supreme Personality of Godhead and you are engaged in the culture of Krishna consciousness. And then this is very important quote here. My dear king, in the place where pure devotees live, following the rules and regulations, and thus purely conscious and engaged with great eagerness in hearing and chanting the glories of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, only in that place, if one gets a chance to hear their constant flow of nectar, which is exactly like the waves of a river, one will forget the necessities of life, which is hunger, thirst, and then become immune to all kinds of fear, lamentation, and illusion. So he made it even more simple. The only solution is listen to the glories of Supreme Personality of Godhead, do not forget him, and then devotional service that will help you to be awakened. Because conditional soul is always disturbed by the bodily necessities of this hunger and thirst, he has very little time to even think of all these nectarian words. That is the problem. So he's also giving us a solution. In the next slide. And after explaining what the problem and the solution, ultimately even Narada Muni is saying that nobody can understand God, even Brahma, Shiva, Manu, Daksha, all other rulers of human mankind, 4 saintly brahmacharis headed by Sanaka and Sanatana, the great sages of Marichi, Atri, Angira, Pulastya, Pulaha, Kratu, Bhrugu, Vashishta, and he's saying even myself. Narada Muni is saying even myself. We're all stalwart brahmanas who can easily speak authoritatively on Vedic literature. We are very powerful. We do austerities, meditation, and education. But even after inquiring about the Supreme Personality of Godhead, whom we always see, because they're always seeing face to face, even we do not perfectly understand about him. So this is so important here that someone may have Vedic knowledge and then someone may worship demigod. All this will not help anyone to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So now the question is, so how can we understand? Only when a person is fully engaged in devotional service, then he is favored by the Lord. Krishna will show the mercy. Then at that time, the awakened devotee, he will give up all the material activities and ritualistic performances mentioned in the Vedas. So the simple solution here is that fully engaged in devotional service. Otherwise, even the great personalities, though they have a lot of knowledge and they worship, they cannot get Krishna's mercy. Only when you engage in devotional service. So Narada Muni is making it even more easier to King Pracinabarhi to understand this. So this is from text 42 to 46. Now let's go to the, Let's go to the next slide. Now he's giving an advice. So now that I have explained all this, you do not forget and do not become ignorant and don't become less intelligent by getting carried away by all this. Your only activities should be those that can please personality of Godhead. Our education should be such that we should become elevated to Krishna consciousness. Don't fall into this trap. Don't become ignorant. So and he makes a very good point here. My dear king, the entire world is covered with the sharp points of kusha grass. And on the strength of this, you have become proud, and that's why you have killed so many animals. And then you have performed various types of animals you have killed various animals and used them in performing various sacrifices. And because of this foolishness, you really do not know what is even devotional service. So he's saying, please only do those activities which will only please personality of Godhead. Very simple. Now let's go to the next slide. More continues. Everyone should take the shelter of his lotus feet. Only by doing so, one's life will be auspicious. Very easy, because he's the supreme personality of Godhead is the super soul, and he's the supreme controller of all the material activities. So why you end up doing material activities? Instead, you take shelter at his lotus feet, then everything will follow. And what are the advantages? And why do we do this? Because Supreme Personality of Godhead is the super soul and friend. And after explaining all this, Narada Muni is saying, the one person who knows this secret, he's said as actually educated. And once you get educated, then you become the spiritual master. And once you become the spiritual master, then your representative of Krishna is not different from Krishna, just like our Srila Prabhupada. He got the secret, That's how he got educated. Then he became spiritual master. Then he became bona fide spiritual master. And then he is the representative of Krishna, and he's not different from Krishna. So he made it even more easy. Like, you do all the devotional service. You do only that activity that will please Krishna. And now why you have to do that? By doing that, you will get this secret that only by taking shelter at his lotus feet, one's life will be auspicious. And then this is the conclusion. Then, even then, he gives even more simple analogy of the fourth analogy, which is about the deer. So once a deer was going in a flower garden and happily enjoying the nice bumblebee sweet singing, and he was even with his wife. But the sad situation was he couldn't see that there was a tiger right in front of him and there was a hunter right behind him. Imagine what would happen. But what to do? He is ignorant, and that's why he's not able to see neither the tiger nor the hunter. So Narada Muni says, this living entity enjoys life of sense gratification from his tongue to his genitals, just like enjoying the aroma of a flower, like how deer was enjoying. And he considers that he's very happy in his family life. But what's happening here? He's forgetting that there's a tiger, which is like a time. There's a time before him, which is saying, your lifespan is reducing. And then behind him, there's a hunter. And who is that hunter? It's none other than the death. The superintendent of death is saying, we are coming to you anytime, you'll be killed. So the simple takeaway from this slide is that give up the household life, as well as all the other stories. Take shelter of Supreme Personality of Godhead. Don't think that you're very happy in this family life. So in this way, please give up your attraction for all the material existence. So this is the another last analogy, because there were 4 analogies from 52 to 55. This is this. And the next slide, in spite of Narada Muni saying all these 4 analogies and then why it is important, still Pracinabarhi has 2 questions. One is, my dear Brahmana, whatever you said, I've really understood. But the thing is, why did my teachers did not tell me about this knowledge? If they were aware of it, why they did not explain to me? And then Pracinabarhi also says that I really understand the difference between devotional service, knowledge, and renunciation. I did have some doubts, but now I'm clear. I completely understand that even great sages cannot understand the real purpose of life. But I have just one more question. One is, how is it possible that we enjoy or suffer the reactions of that work in a different body? Because his point here is that whatever a living entity does in one life, they're enjoyed in the next life. But practically, we are saying that the body that performed the work in the last birth is lost. Then how can we say that you're still getting those reactions in a different body? So for that, Narada Muni very easily he explains, the living entity acts in a gross body, and this body is forced to act by the subtle body. And that subtle body is composed of mind, intelligence, and ego. After that gross body is lost, the subtle body is still there. It's not gone. So that's why it continues to enjoy and suffer. So there's no change. And then one good point, Narada Muni says that all of us have this bodily conception of I am this, I am that, my duty is this, and therefore I shall do it. These are all mental impressions which are very temporary. But by the grace of Supreme Personality of Godhead, the living entity gets a chance to execute all his mental concoctions. That's why he gets another body. Now, with all this, we can understand why we got another body. But the problem is, Narada Muni is making it very clear in one point. There is no possibility of concocting anything mentally without having perceived it in the previous body. So it's clear that it's the same body which is getting in the next birth. But why do we keep getting this body? Because the mind, which is the main cause of the living entities attaining a certain type of body in accordance with his association with material nature. So it's the mind that is indicating your past and future bodies. This is from text 60 to 66. And then in another 2 slides, we will say what Narada Muni is, how he is answering to King Pracinabarhi's questions. Krishna conscious means we constantly associating with Supreme Personality of Godhead, and in such kind of mental state, the devotee can actually observe the cosmic manifestation exactly as the Supreme Personality of Godhead does. And also, like when we are in deep sleep and at the time of death, when our body temperature is very high, the movement of the life air is arrested. At that time, the living entity loses the knowledge of identifying the body with the self. Until then, we are so attached to this body and we identify ourselves as this body. And then Narad Muni is giving a summary in this sentence. Similarly, the living entity with undeveloped senses does not cease to exist materially, even though he may not be exactly in contact with the sense objects. So he carries with the subtle body. And on next slide, he's concluding. Just like how a caterpillar takes its form from one leaf to another, similarly, according to his previous work, the living entity must capture another body before giving up the one he has. This is because it's the mind. As we just said, mind was the main cause. The mind is the reservoir of all kinds of desires. By virtue of processes of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up gross bodies. This is known as transmigration of the soul. Thus, the soul becomes subjected to different types of so-called enjoyment, lamentation, fear, happiness, and unhappiness. So to be enlightened by this perfect knowledge, one should always engage himself in the devotional service of the Lord. So Narad Muni answered both the questions, and again he's concluding, he's back to the same point. We should always engage in devotional service of the Lord. So this whole story, which Narad Muni was saying, like 4 chapters before, Maitreya Muni was answering to Vidura. So finally, now the conclusion is Maitreya Muni is saying, this is how Narad Muni explained the constitutional position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity to King Pracinabarhi, and then he left to Siddhaloka. And then what did Pracinabarhi do after that? He also gave all his orders to ministers, and then he told his sons, please protect the citizens. And then he left home, and then he went to Kapilashrama. And there what he did, he underwent a lot of austerities, penances. He was always engaged in the transcendental loving service of the Lord and attained a spiritual position qualitatively equal to that of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the final conclusion of this chapter, Maitreya Muni is explaining how important is this particular chapter. 3 reasons. By hearing or relating this narration from Narad Muni about the living entity's spiritual existence, one will be liberated from the bodily conception of life. Very, very, very lucky. And then this narration is filled with transcendental fame of Supreme Personality of Godhead. So when it is described, we have 4 wonderful advantages. First, the material world is sanctified, and then it purifies the heart of the living entity, and then it helps the living entity to attain his spiritual identity, and the last, one will be liberated from all the material bondage, which is the purpose of the life. So this allegory of King Puranjana was heard by Maitreya Muni from his spiritual master, and this story is full of spiritual knowledge. So if one understands the purpose of this allegory, he will be relieved from the bodily conception and understand life after death. If this transmigration of the soul is not understood, it can be understood at least by fully studying this narration. Now at the end, our great spiritual master Srila Prabhupada is telling in the purport, the vivid descriptions of the subtle and gross bodies in this chapter are most scientific, and because they are given by the great sage Narada, they are also authoritative. So they are scientific and they are authoritative. And because these narrations are full of the glory of Supreme Personality of Godhead, they constitute the most effective process for the purification of the mind. That's the end of the chapter. Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Mataji, for giving me this opportunity. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Hare Krishna Mataji. Nice presentation, Mataji. Nice presentation, Mataji.
Amid all the other things that you're doing.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Hare Krishna everybody. Hare Krishna.
1 minute.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Hare Krishna.
Recording?
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
45 seconds left.
Oh.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Mataji.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Hare Krishna everyone.